think I'm having a heart attack. It hurts.
We're very busy. This ER is no place for you to whine. Everyone's waiting, and so are you. Stop bothering us.
Veteran begged for help. Then a Black Hawk landed in the hospital parking lot. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital emergency room cast a harsh glare over the crowded waiting area as 72-year-old John Miller clutched his chest, trying to breathe through the crushing pain that had been building for the past hour. His weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work and military service, trembled slightly as he approached the reception desk for the third time. "Please," John said quietly to the young receptionist, his voice barely audible over the noise of the busy emergency room. "I think I'm having a heart attack. The pain is getting worse." The receptionist, barely out of college and overwhelmed by the Friday night rush, barely looked up from her computer screen. "Sir, I told you already. Without your insurance card, you'll have to wait until we can verify your coverage. Take a seat and someone will call you when we're ready." John nodded silently, his military training preventing him from making a scene despite the fire spreading across his chest. He had learned long ago not to be a burden, not to demand attention, not to make waves. It was a lesson that had served him well during 3 tours in Vietnam, but it was failing him now when he needed help most. As he shuffled back to his seat in the corner, John's mind drifted to another time when he had faced death, a humid jungle morning in 1971, when his unit had walked into an ambush. He had been just 20 years old, then a young soldier who had thrown himself on a grenade to save his squad, earning a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star that now sat forgotten in a drawer at home. The irony wasn't lost on him. 50 years ago, he had been willing to die for strangers. Now those same strangers seemed unwilling to help him live. John pressed his hand against his chest, feeling his heart racing irregularly beneath his ribs. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his vision began to blur around the edges. He thought of Sarah, his wife of 45 years, who was visiting their daughter in California and had no idea he was in trouble. Around him, the emergency room continued its chaotic dance of medical urgency, but John felt invisible, forgotten, just another elderly man taking up space in an overcrowded system. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the last time anyone had really seen him, not just looked at him, but truly seen who he was and what he had done for his country. The pain in his chest intensified, and John Miller, decorated war hero and quiet guardian of American freedom, began to wonder if he would die alone and unnoticed in a hospital waiting room. As the minutes ticked by, John's condition continued to deteriorate. His breathing became more labored, and the crushing pain in his chest spread down his left arm with increasing intensity. Despite his growing distress, he remained seated quietly in the corner, his military discipline preventing him from causing a disturbance. Across the waiting room, a young mother struggled with her crying toddler who had fallen and scraped his knee at the playground. The child's wails echoed through the emergency room, adding to the chaos and stress of an already overwhelming environment. John watched the scene unfold, and despite his own pain, he felt moved to help. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small wooden horse that he had carved himself, a hobby he had taken up after retirement. With great effort, he stood and slowly made his way over to the distressed family. "Excuse me," John said softly to the mother, his voice strained but kind. "Would it be okay if I gave this to your little boy? Sometimes a small distraction can help. The mother looked up, surprised by the gentle offer from the elderly stranger. She nodded gratefully, and John knelt down carefully beside the crying child, his knees protesting the movement. "Hey there, soldier," John said quietly, using the same tone he had once used to comfort wounded comrades. "I made this horse myself. His name is Thunder, and he's very brave. Would you like to take care of him for me?" The toddler's crying subsided as he examined the intricately carved wooden horse, his small fingers tracing the smooth surface. John smiled, despite his pain, finding comfort in the child's wonder. "Thank you so much," the mother said, tears in her eyes. "That was incredibly kind." John nodded and slowly made his way back to his seat, but the effort had taken its toll. His face was now noticeably pale, and a bluish tinge had appeared around his lips, classic signs of cardiac distress that would have been immediately recognized by any medical professional who bothered to look. Calvin "Cal" Roberts, a security guard and Navy veteran working the night shift, had been observing the waiting room from his position near the entrance. Something about the elderly man in the corner had caught his attention. Perhaps it was the military bearing that never quite left a veteran, or the quiet dignity with which he endured his obvious suffering. Cal had seen enough combat in his own Navy service to recognize when someone was in serious trouble. He watched as John returned to his seat, noting the man's labored breathing and the way he kept pressing his hand to his chest. "Amy," Cal called quietly to Amy Fields, a pediatric nurse who was passing through the waiting area. "Take a look at the gentleman in the corner. Something's not right." Amy followed Cal's gaze and immediately saw what he had noticed. Her medical training kicked in as she observed John's symptoms, the pale complexion, the shallow breathing, the obvious distress he was trying so hard to hide. "Oh my God," Amy whispered. "He's having a heart attack. How long has he been sitting there like that?" "At least an hour," Cal replied grimly. "I've been watching him get worse and nobody's paying attention." Amy started toward John, but Cal caught her arm. "Wait," he said, his mind racing. "I have an idea. This man is a veteran, I can tell. And if he's been sitting here for an hour with obvious cardiac symptoms, something's very wrong with how he's being treated." Cal pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for: Martin Kelly, his former commanding officer, who now worked as a senior coordinator in the Veterans Affairs Outreach Unit. "This might be irregular," Cal said to Amy, "but sometimes you'll have to break the rules to do what's right." Cal's call to Martin Kelly was answered on the second ring despite the late hour. The bond between military personnel never truly faded, and Kelly had always made it clear that his veterans could reach him any time, day or night. "Cal, what's the situation?" Kelly's voice was immediately alert, recognizing the urgency in his former subordinate's tone. "I'm at St. Mary's Hospital, and there's a veteran here who's been ignored for over an hour while having what looks like a massive heart attack," Cal explained quickly. "The staff won't see him because of some insurance issue, and he's too proud to make a scene. Martin, this guy is dying while they shuffle paperwork." Kelly's response was immediate and decisive. "Give me his name and any details you can. I'm activating emergency protocols now." Cal approached John carefully, noting how the man's condition had worsened even in the few minutes since he'd made the call. "Sir, I'm Cal Roberts, Hospital Security. I'm also Navy retired. Can you tell me your name and service record?" John looked up with eyes that were becoming increasingly unfocused. "John Miller," he whispered. Army 3 tours in Vietnam, Purple Heart, Bronze Star. He paused, struggling to breathe, but that was a long time ago. Cal relayed the information to Kelly, who immediately began working his contacts within the VA system. What Kelly discovered in John's service record made him sit up straight in his chair. "Cal, listen to me very carefully," Kelly said, his voice tight with urgency and something approaching awe. "John Miller isn't just any veteran. He's a Medal of Honor recipient. In 1971, he single-handedly held off an enemy assault for 6 hours after his unit was ambushed, saving the lives of 23 soldiers. One of those soldiers was Lieutenant Robert Vance." Cal felt his blood run cold. Vance, as in Colonel Elizabeth Vance. Her father, Kelly, confirmed. "Cal, you've got a living legend dying in that waiting room. I'm making calls now. Do whatever you have to do to keep him alive until help arrives." As Kelly worked his network of contacts, Cal and Amy took matters into their own hands. Amy approached the reception desk with the authority of someone who had spent years advocating for patients. "That man in the corner needs immediate medical attention," she told the receptionist firmly. "He's showing classic signs of myocardial infarction." The receptionist looked up with annoyance. "Ma'am, I've told him already that he needs to wait for insurance verification. We have protocols." "Protocols that don't include letting people die in your waiting room," Amy interrupted. "I'm a nurse, and I'm telling you that man is having a heart attack right now." But the receptionist remained unmoved, citing hospital policy and insurance requirements. It was then that Cal made a decision that would change everything. "Fine," Cal said, pulling out his phone again. "If you won't help him, I'm calling the media. Let's see how your hospital likes explaining why they let a Medal of Honor recipient die because of paperwork." The threat of negative publicity finally got the receptionist's attention, but before she could respond, the sound of rotor blades began to echo across the hospital parking lot. Through the windows, everyone could see a military Black Hawk helicopter settling down on the asphalt, its presence immediately drawing crowds of onlookers and hospital staff. "What the hell is that?" the receptionist demanded, but Cal was already smiling grimly. "That," he said, "is what happens when you ignore a hero." The helicopter's doors opened, and Colonel Elizabeth Vance emerged in full dress uniform, her ribbons and decorations catching the light as she strode purposefully toward the hospital entrance. Behind her came a team of military medical personnel and VA officials, their presence transforming the chaotic emergency room into something resembling a military operation. Colonel Vance approached the reception desk with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and unaccustomed to being denied. "I'm Colonel Elizabeth Vance, United States Army. I'm here for Sergeant Major John Miller. Where is he?" The receptionist, now thoroughly intimidated by the military presence, stammered out directions to John's location in the waiting room. Colonel Vance followed her gaze and saw the elderly man slumped in the corner chair, his breathing shallow and his face gray with pain. "Sergeant Major Miller," Colonel Vance said, as she approached, her voice carrying both authority and deep respect. "I'm Colonel Vance. My father was Lieutenant Robert Vance, 1st Infantry Division. You saved his life in Vietnam." John looked up with confusion and recognition flickering in his eyes. "Bobby Vance, little Bobby, from Chicago." "Yes, sir," Colonel Vance replied, her voice thick with emotion. "He told me about you every day of my life. He said you were the bravest man he ever knew." The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as Colonel Vance's arrival triggered a complete transformation in how John Miller was being treated. The same hospital staff who had ignored him for over an hour suddenly sprang into action, but Colonel Vance was having none of their sudden attention. "Where is your chief administrator?" Colonel Vance demanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat zones. "I want to speak with whoever is responsible for allowing a Medal of Honor recipient to sit untreated for over an hour." The receptionist, now pale and shaking frantically, called for the hospital's chief administrator, while the military medical team that had arrived with Colonel Vance began their own assessment of John's condition. "Sergeant Major, we're going to take care of you now," said Captain Maria Santos, the team's lead medic. "Can you tell me about your symptoms?" John, still struggling to process the surreal turn of events, managed to describe his chest pain and breathing difficulties. Captain Santos immediately recognized the severity of his condition and began barking orders to the hospital staff. "This man needs a cardiac catheterization lab immediately," she announced. "He's in the middle of a massive myocardial infarction, and every minute we delay increases the risk of permanent damage or death." Dr. Patricia Chen, the emergency room physician who had been dealing with other patients, finally appeared and was briefed on John's condition. Her face went white as she realized the magnitude of what had happened. "How long has he been waiting?" Dr. Chen asked, already knowing she wouldn't like the answer. "Over an hour," Colonel Vance replied coldly. "An hour during which your staff repeatedly turned him away because of insurance paperwork." The hospital's chief administrator, Dr. Michael Harrison, arrived to find his emergency room occupied by military personnel and his staff in crisis mode. Colonel Vance wasted no time in confronting him about the situation. "Dr. Harrison, I'm Colonel Vance with the U.S. Army. This man is Sergeant Major John Miller, Medal of Honor recipient, and your staff has been negligent in providing him with emergency medical care. I want to know how you're going to fix this situation." Dr. Harrison, faced with a potential public relations nightmare and genuine concern for patient care, immediately ordered John to be taken to the cardiac catheterization lab. But the damage had already been done. John's condition had deteriorated significantly during his long wait. As John was being prepared for emergency surgery, Colonel Vance stayed by his side, holding his hand and speaking to him in the calm, reassuring tones of a fellow soldier. "Sergeant Major, you're going to be okay," she said. "The best cardiac team in the state is going to take care of you, and when you wake up, I want to tell you about my father, about how he lived a full, happy life because of what you did for him." John squeezed her hand, weakly, tears forming in his eyes. I never expected anyone to remember." "Sir, heroes are never forgotten," Colonel Vance replied. "Sometimes it just takes a while for people to remember where to look for them." As John was wheeled into surgery, the full scope of the crisis became clear. The story of his treatment or lack thereof was already spreading through social media and news outlets. The image of a Black Hawk helicopter landing at a hospital to rescue a forgotten veteran was exactly the kind of story that captured public imagination and outrage. Cal Roberts, who had initiated the chain of events with his phone call, found himself being interviewed by reporters who had arrived on the scene. "I just couldn't stand by and watch a hero suffer in silence," he told them. "Every veteran deserves better than what happened here tonight." Amy Fields, the nurse who had first recognized John's symptoms, was also thrust into the spotlight as someone who had tried to advocate for proper patient care. "This isn't about military service or medals," she said. "This is about basic human decency and medical ethics. No one should be ignored when they're having a heart attack." The crisis had exposed systemic problems in how the hospital treated patients, particularly those who didn't fit the profile of ideal customers. The receptionist, who had repeatedly turned John away, was suspended pending investigation while the hospital faced intense scrutiny from both the media and medical regulatory bodies. But the most important crisis was still unfolding in the operating room, where surgeons worked to save the life of a man who had once risked everything to save others and who had nearly died because no one bothered to see past his quiet dignity to recognize his need for help. The cardiac surgery to save John Miller's life lasted 4 critical hours, during which Colonel Vance maintained her vigil in the hospital waiting room, now transformed into an impromptu command center for military and VA officials. Word of the incident had spread rapidly through veteran networks and social media, drawing attention from across the country. Dr. Sarah Kim, the lead cardiac surgeon, emerged from the operating room with cautious optimism. "The surgery was successful," she announced to the assembled group. "We were able to clear the blockages and restore blood flow to his heart. However, the delay in treatment did cause some damage. If he had received care when he first arrived, the outcome would have been significantly better." Colonel Vance felt a mixture of relief and anger at Dr. Kim's words. "Doctor, what you're telling us is that the negligence of this hospital staff directly contributed to the severity of his condition." "That's correct," Dr. Kim replied without hesitation. "The first hour after the onset of cardiac symptoms is critical. Every minute of delay increases the risk of permanent heart damage." As news of John's condition spread, the hospital began receiving calls from veterans organizations, military officials, and media outlets from around the world. The story of the forgotten hero who had nearly died while being ignored had struck a nerve with people who understood the sacrifice and service that veterans had provided. Eric Miller, John's son, arrived at the hospital after receiving a frantic call from his mother. The 45-year-old engineer had driven through the night from Chicago, his mind racing with worry and confusion about how his father had ended up in such a crisis. "I don't understand," Eric told Colonel Vance as they waited for John to wake up from surgery. "My father never talks about his military service. I knew he was in Vietnam, but I had no idea about any medals or heroic actions." Colonel Vance smiled sadly. "That's typical of men like your father. The real heroes rarely talk about what they've done. They just quietly go about their lives carrying their experiences and their sacrifices without seeking recognition." She pulled out her phone and showed Eric a photograph of a young soldier in jungle fatigues. "This is my father, Lieutenant Robert Vance, taken just days before the battle where your father saved his life. Your dad held off an entire enemy company for 6 hours, allowing my father and 22 other soldiers to be evacuated to safety." Eric stared at the photograph, seeing his father's story through new eyes. "He never told us any of this. We just knew he had some old medals in a drawer, but he never talked about them." "Men like your father don't serve for recognition," Colonel Vance explained. "They serve because it's the right thing to do. And when they come home, they just want to blend back into civilian life and be normal people again." The climactic moment came when John finally woke up in the cardiac intensive care unit, surrounded by more attention than he had received in decades. Colonel Vance was at his bedside, along with Eric's several VA officials and a growing number of hospital staff who had come to pay their respects. "How are you feeling, Sergeant Major?" Colonel Vance asked gently as John's eyes focused on her face. "Confused?" John admitted weakly. "I'm not sure I understand what's happening." Colonel Vance took his hand and began to tell him the story of how his actions in Vietnam had rippled through the decades. She spoke of her father's successful military career, his happy marriage, his children and grandchildren, all made possible because John Miller had refused to abandon his post during that terrible battle in 1971. "Sir, because of what you did, my father lived to see me graduate from West Point." Colonel Vance said, tears in her eyes. "He walked me down the aisle at my wedding. He held his grandchildren. He lived a full, rich life for 45 years after Vietnam, and every day of that life was a gift from you." John listened in amazement as Colonel Vance continued her story, describing how her father had searched for years, trying to find the soldier who had saved him, only to learn that John had changed his name after the war and had deliberately tried to disappear from military records. "Why did you change your name?" Eric asked his father, still processing the revelations about his dad's heroic past. John was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I didn't want to be defined by one day in the jungle," he said finally. "I wanted to be just a regular person, a husband and father, not some war hero. I thought if I changed my name and moved away, I could leave all that behind and just be normal." The climax reached its peak when Martin Kelly arrived with a special presentation. The VA had expedited the processing of John's full military honors, and Kelly carried with him not just John's original medals, but documentation of commendations and honors that had been lost in bureaucratic shuffles over the decades. "Sergeant Major John Miller," Kelly announced formally, "on behalf of a grateful nation, I want to present you with the recognition that should have followed you throughout your civilian life." As Kelly read the citations for John's Medal of Honor, Bronze Star and Purple Heart, the hospital room filled with people who had come to witness this moment of long overdue recognition. Nurses, doctors, security guards, and hospital administrators crowded into the doorway, many with tears in their eyes, as they listened to the account of John's extraordinary courage. "You saved 23 lives that day," Kelly concluded, "and today those 23 lives have become hundreds of children and grandchildren who exist because of your courage. You didn't just save soldiers, you saved entire family lines." John looked around the room at all the faces focused on him with respect and admiration, and for the first time in decades, he felt truly seen and valued for who he was and what he had done. 3 months after the incident at St. Mary's Hospital, the ripple effects of John Miller's story continued to transform lives and institutions across the country. The hospital had implemented comprehensive policy changes, including mandatory training for all staff on recognizing medical emergencies and treating all patients with dignity, regardless of their insurance status. Cal Roberts had been promoted to head of hospital security and had established a veteran identification program that ensured former military personnel received priority attention for emergency medical needs. Amy Fields had been appointed as the hospital's new patient advocate with specific responsibilities for ensuring that no patient was ever again ignored or dismissed. The receptionist who had turned John away had been terminated, but the incident had sparked broader conversations about healthcare accessibility and the treatment of vulnerable populations. St. Mary's Hospital had become a model for other medical facilities seeking to improve their patient care protocols. John's recovery had been remarkable, aided not just by excellent medical care, but by the outpouring of support from the veteran community and the general public. His hospital room had become a pilgrimage site for veterans, active duty military personnel, and civilians who wanted to thank him for his service. "I never expected any of this," John would tell his visitors, still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention. "I just did what any soldier would do." Colonel Vance had maintained regular contact with John and his family, and her father's story had finally been completed. Lieutenant Robert Vance, now 74 years old, had flown in from Arizona to meet the man who had saved his life over 50 years earlier. "I've thought about you every day since Vietnam," the elder Vance told John during their emotional reunion. "I named my daughter Elizabeth after my sister, but I always called her my miracle child, because she existed only because you saved my life." Eric Miller had begun documenting his father's story, working with military historians to preserve the accounts of John's service and the impact it had on the families of the men he had saved. The quiet hero who had tried to disappear into civilian life had inadvertently become a symbol of the unrecognized veterans who lived among us. "Dad taught me that real heroism isn't about seeking recognition," Eric would say. "It's about doing the right thing even when no one is watching. But sometimes the world needs to be reminded that heroes walk among us every day." John Miller had finally received the recognition he had never sought, proving that true valor, like true love, has a way of revealing itself when it matters most. This story demonstrates how individual acts of courage can have lasting impacts across generations, and how society must remain vigilant to recognize and honor the quiet heroes who have sacrificed for others.